April 26, 1937. Market day in Guernica, a small Basque town in northern Spain. The streets are crowded with farmers selling vegetables, families shopping, children playing. It's a peaceful Monday afternoon. Then, at 4:30 p.m., the church bells begin to ring. Not for prayer, for warning. Within minutes, the sky darkens with aircraft. German Condor Legion bombers, Italian Aviazione Legionaria fighters. They come in waves, dropping bombs, strafing civilians with machine guns. For 3.5 hours, they reduce Guernica to rubble. When the smoke finally clears, hundreds are dead. The town is burning. This isn't World War II. That won't start for another 2 years. This is Spain, 1937, and what's happening here is something the world has never seen before, a rehearsal for the apocalypse, a testing ground where fascist powers practice the tactics they'll use to conquer Europe, a laboratory where new weapons, new strategies, and new horrors are perfected on human subjects. The Spanish Civil War, a conflict that would kill 500,000 people, destroy a nation, and set the stage for the bloodiest war in human history. This is the story of how Spain became the prelude to World War II. To understand the Spanish Civil War, we need to understand Spain itself, a nation caught between centuries. By the 1930s, most of Europe had entered the modern age. Industrialization, democracy, social reform. These were reshaping societies across the continent. But Spain was different. Spain was stuck. The country was dominated by 3 pillars of traditional power: the monarchy, the Catholic Church, and the military. Together, they controlled vast wealth, while millions of peasants lived in medieval poverty. In southern Spain, enormous estates called latifundios stretched for miles, owned by aristocrats who had never worked a day in their lives, while landless laborers starved. The church owned huge portions of Spain's wealth and wielded enormous political influence. The military was bloated, top-heavy with officers, and saw itself as the guardian of traditional Spanish values. And above it all sat the monarchy, ineffectual and increasingly unpopular. Spain had a parliament, the Cortes, but it was weak and corrupt. Elections were routinely rigged. Real power remained in the hands of the old elites. But change was coming, and it was coming fast. The 1920s brought crisis. Spain's colonial war in Morocco was going disastrously. In 1921, Spanish forces suffered a catastrophic defeat at Annual. Over 13,000 soldiers killed in a matter of days. The military was humiliated. The government was blamed. In 1923, General Miguel Primo de Rivera staged a coup and established a military dictatorship with the king's blessing. For 7 years, Primo de Rivera ruled Spain as a dictator. But he couldn't solve Spain's fundamental problems. Economic troubles mounted. Opposition grew. In 1930, Primo de Rivera resigned. The king, Alfonso XIII, tried to restore constitutional government, but it was too late. He had lost all legitimacy by supporting the dictatorship. In April 1931, Spain held municipal elections. The results were stunning. Republican candidates, those who wanted to abolish the monarchy and establish a modern democratic republic, won overwhelming victories in Spain's cities. Alfonso XIII looked at the results and realized he had lost. Rather than face civil war, he abdicated and fled into exile. On April 14, 1931, the Second Spanish Republic was born. The crowds in Madrid erupted in celebration. Finally, Spain would join the modern world. Finally, there would be democracy, reform, justice, or so they hoped. The new republic faced impossible expectations. The left wanted radical change, land reform, workers' rights, separation of church and state, regional autonomy. The right wanted to preserve traditional Spain and viewed the Republic as a dangerous experiment that threatened everything they held sacred. The Republican government, led by a coalition of liberals and moderate socialists, tried to please everyone. In doing so, they satisfied no one. They attempted land reform, but moved too slowly for the peasants and too fast for the landlords. They reduced the military's size and budget, making the officer corps furious. They limited the church's role in education, enraging Catholics. They granted autonomy to Catalonia, provoking Spanish nationalists. Every reform created enemies. And those enemies were organizing. On the left, anarchists, who wanted to abolish all government, were strong in Catalonia and Andalusia. They thought the Republic wasn't going far enough. Revolutionary socialists and the small but growing Communist Party agreed. They wanted social revolution, not parliamentary reform. On the right, monarchists wanted the king back. Catholics saw the Republic as godless. Landowners viewed land reform as theft. Military officers felt insulted and undermined. And a new movement was emerging, inspired by Mussolini's fascists in Italy. The Falange, led by José Antonio Primo de Rivera, the dictator's son. Spain was being pulled apart. Elections in 1933 brought the right to power. For 2 years, the Black Biennium, as the left called it, conservative governments reversed Republican reforms. They returned land to landlords. They invited the church back into education. They cracked down on labor unions. In October 1934, the left rebelled. In Asturias, a mining region in northern Spain, socialist and anarchist miners launched an armed uprising. They seized control of the region, established workers' communes, and held out for 2 weeks. The government's response was brutal. They sent in the Spanish Foreign Legion and Moroccan troops, commanded by General Francisco Franco. The uprising was crushed with extreme violence. Over 1,000 rebels were killed. Thousands more were imprisoned and tortured. The left would remember Asturias. They would remember Franco. By 1936, Spain was a nation on the edge of collapse. The left and right weren't just political opponents, they saw each other as existential enemies. Compromise seemed impossible. Violence was becoming routine. Street battles between leftist and rightist militias were common. Political assassinations increased. In February 1936, Spain held new elections. This time, the left organized a coalition called the Popular Front. Socialists, communists, anarchists, and Republicans united against the right. The right formed its own coalition, the National Front. The campaign was vicious. Both sides warned that if the other won, Spain would be destroyed. The Popular Front won by a narrow margin. The left exploded in celebration. The right refused to accept the results. In the spring of 1936, Spain descended into chaos. Political violence spiraled out of control. Churches were burned. Right-wing militants attacked leftist politicians. Leftist militias retaliated. Assassinations became almost daily occurrences. The government was losing control. The Popular Front coalition was fractured. Moderate Republicans were paralyzed, afraid of both right-wing rebellion and left-wing revolution. Meanwhile, radical workers were seizing factories. Peasants were occupying land without waiting for legal reform. The anarchists spoke openly of revolution. And in military barracks across Spain, a conspiracy was forming. A group of generals, led by Emilio Mola, began planning a coup. They would overthrow the Republic and restore order, their version of order. They reached out to other sympathetic officers, including Francisco Franco, who commanded Spanish forces in Morocco. The conspirators waited for the right moment. They found it on July 12, 1936. José Calvo Sotelo, a prominent right-wing politician and monarchist leader, was assassinated by Republican assault guards, apparently in retaliation for the murder of a left-wing police officer. Calvo Sotelo's funeral became a massive demonstration of right-wing outrage. The generals decided the time had come. On July 17, 1936, military garrisons in Spanish Morocco rebelled against the government. Within hours, army units across Spain were rising up. The pronunciamiento, the military coup, had begun. But something unexpected happened. The coup didn't succeed. In many cities, workers and civilians, armed by loyal Republican authorities or seizing weapons themselves, fought back. In Madrid and Barcelona, the rebellion was crushed within days. Loyal military units and armed workers battled rebel forces street by street. Spain split in two. Roughly half the country, including most of the north and east, plus Madrid, remained loyal to the Republic. The other half, including most of the south, west, and northwest, fell to the rebels, who called themselves nationalists. The Spanish Civil War had begun, and it would last for nearly 3 years of unimaginable brutality. Let's be clear about what this war was and what it wasn't. This wasn't a clean conflict between two armies on a battlefield. This was a war where neighbors killed neighbors, where families were split apart, where old grudges turned lethal, where ideology mattered more than blood. In Republican territory, revolutionary committees sprang up. Workers seized control of factories. Peasants collectivized land. The old social order was being torn down. But with revolution came chaos and terror. In the first months of the war, thousands of priests, nuns, and monks were killed by Republican militias and mobs. Churches were ransacked and burned. The violence was driven partly by anti-clerical ideology, partly by revenge for centuries of church alliance with the oppressors, and partly by the breakdown of law and order. Businessmen, landlords, suspected nationalist sympathizers, anyone associated with the old regime, faced arrest, summary trials, or outright murder. The Republican zone was gripped by revolutionary violence, but the nationalist zone was even worse. The nationalists weren't fighting to restore democracy. They were fighting to destroy it. From the very beginning, their strategy included systematic terror. As nationalist forces captured territory, they implemented a policy of limpieza, cleansing. They would round up school teachers, labor union members, Republican officials, intellectuals, anyone who had supported the Republic. Then they would execute them. Sometimes the executions were preceded by mock trials. Often they weren't. People were shot in batches and buried in mass graves. Estimates suggest that nationalist forces executed at least 150,000 civilians during the war, possibly many more. The most famous nationalist general, Gonzalo Queipo de Llano, bragged on the radio about his force's brutality. He spoke of his men spreading terror among Republicans. He called it a necessary part of the campaign. This wasn't collateral damage. This was deliberate policy. The nationalists were conducting a campaign of extermination against anyone associated with the left, with liberalism, with modernity itself. And leading this crusade was Francisco Franco. Franco was 43 when the war began. He was short, soft-spoken, and utterly ruthless. He had made his reputation fighting colonial wars in Morocco, where he had learned that extreme brutality could be effective. Now he would apply those lessons to Spain. In September 1936, the nationalist generals named Franco Generalissimo, supreme commander of their forces. More than that, they named him caudillo, leader. Franco wasn't just a general, he was becoming a dictator. Franco's strategy was methodical. Rather than rush toward Madrid, he moved slowly, consolidating control over captured territory, eliminating opposition, and building a stable rear area. When he diverted forces to relieve the besieged nationalist garrison at Toledo instead of pushing for Madrid, his German advisors were frustrated. But Franco understood something they didn't. He wasn't just fighting a military war. He was fighting a political war to reshape Spain. The Republicans, meanwhile, were struggling with their own internal conflicts. The Republican side was never truly united. It was a coalition of groups with fundamentally different goals. The moderate Republicans wanted to defend democracy and constitutional government. The Socialists wanted social reform within a democratic framework. The Communists, taking their orders from Stalin's Soviet Union, wanted to win the war first and postpone revolution. The anarchists wanted immediate social revolution and didn't trust any form of centralized government. These tensions would plague the Republic throughout the war. In Catalonia, anarchist militias had taken control of Barcelona. They collectivized industries, abolished money in some areas, and ran their own war effort. They were brave fighters, but they rejected military discipline and hierarchical command structures. Their militia columns fought when and where they chose. Meanwhile, the Communist Party, though small before the war, was growing rapidly. Why? Because Stalin's Soviet Union was providing aid to the Republic, and Stalin's condition for that aid was communist influence over Republican policy. The Soviets sent weapons, advisors, and the international brigades, volunteer units of foreign fighters from around the world who came to fight fascism in Spain. This aid was crucial. Without it, the Republic might have collapsed immediately. But it came at a price. The Communists demanded centralization, military discipline, and the suppression of revolutionary experiments. They particularly hated the anarchists and Trotskyists, seeing them as dangerous rivals. In May 1937, these tensions exploded. In Barcelona, Communist forces attacked anarchist and POUM, a Trotskyist party, positions. Street fighting erupted. The conflict within the Republic became an open civil war within the Civil War. Hundreds died. The Communists won. Revolutionary experiments were dismantled. The Republic became more centralized and disciplined, better able to fight the war, but at the cost of the revolutionary ideals that had motivated many of its defenders. George Orwell, who fought in a POUM militia, witnessed these events. His disillusionment would later inspire his books critiquing totalitarianism. Spain taught Orwell that revolutions devour their own. But here's what made the Spanish Civil War truly significant. It wasn't just a Spanish conflict. It became an international war, the first major clash between fascism and anti-fascism, the opening round of World War II. And everyone knew it. When the war began, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy immediately saw an opportunity. Here was a chance to support fellow fascists, expand their influence, and, most importantly, test their militaries in real combat conditions. Within weeks, Germany's Luftwaffe created the Condor Legion, a force of about 5,000 personnel equipped with the latest aircraft, tanks, and weapons. They officially claimed these were volunteers. In reality, they were active-duty German military units. Italy was even more blatant. Mussolini eventually sent over 70,000 troops to Spain, along with aircraft, tanks, and artillery. He wanted Spain as an ally and saw the war as a chance to build Italian prestige. Germany and Italy didn't just send equipment and leave. They used Spain as a laboratory. They tested new weapons. They developed new tactics. They learned what worked and what didn't, all at Spain's expense. The most infamous example was Guernica. That bombing in April 1937 that we opened with, that wasn't just a military operation. It was an experiment in terror bombing. The Condor Legion wanted to see what would happen if you bombed a civilian population center with no military value. What they learned was that terror bombing worked. It spread fear. It demoralized civilians. It was efficient. 2 years later, they would use these same tactics in Warsaw, then Rotterdam, then London during the Blitz. The lessons learned at Guernica would be applied across Europe. Germany also tested its new Panzer tanks in Spain. They learned how to coordinate armor with infantry and air support. the Blitzkrieg tactics that would devastate Poland and France. Spain was their training ground. The German and Italian officers who fought in Spain would become the commanders of World War II. The tactics developed in Spain would reshape modern warfare. But what about the democracies? What about Britain, France, and the United States? Surely they would support the Spanish Republic against fascist aggression. They didn't. In August 1936, Britain and France organized a non-intervention agreement. The idea was that all foreign powers would agree not to intervene in Spain. 27 nations signed it. It was a farce from day one. Germany and Italy signed the agreement and immediately violated it, sending massive aid to Franco. The Soviet Union signed and sent aid to the Republic. Only the democracies actually honored their pledge. Britain's conservative government, led by Stanley Baldwin and then Neville Chamberlain, was terrified of another war. They were also more afraid of communism than of fascism. Many British politicians thought Franco, authoritarian but not crazy like Hitler, was the safer option. France's Popular Front government wanted to help the Republic. Prime Minister Léon Blum was sympathetic. But France was deeply divided, and the British pressured them not to intervene. French aid to the Republic remained minimal and unofficial. The United States, in its isolationist phase, passed neutrality laws that banned arms sales to either side in Spain. In practice, this helped Franco, since Germany and Italy were already arming him. The U.S. embargo just meant the Republic couldn't buy weapons legally. So we arrive at this bitter irony. The democratically elected Spanish Republic was starved of support by the world's democracies, while the fascist rebellion was armed to the teeth by fascist dictatorships. The Republic's primary supporter became Stalin's Soviet Union, which came with its own serious problems, as we've seen. Still, thousands of individuals wouldn't stand aside. They believed fascism had to be stopped in Spain, or it would spread across the world. Over 35,000 volunteers from more than 50 countries came to Spain to fight for the Republic. They formed the International Brigades, perhaps the most idealistic military units ever assembled. There were the Abraham Lincoln Brigade from the United States, many of them young leftists from New York, Chicago, and other cities, with no military experience but burning conviction. The British Battalion, the Canadian Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, the German Thälmann Battalion, and Italian Garibaldi Battalion, anti-fascists who had fled their own dictatorships and now fought to stop fascism from spreading. Among them were poets and intellectuals. Ernest Hemingway covered the war and supported the Republic. George Orwell fought in the trenches. The poets W.H. Auden and Stephen Spender wrote in support of the Republican cause. These volunteers fought in some of the war's bloodiest battles, at Jarama, at Brunette, at Teruel. They suffered appalling casualties. Nearly a third of all International Brigade volunteers died in Spain. But their bravery couldn't change the fundamental mathematics of the war. Franco had more men, more weapons, more supplies, more support. The Republic had passion and courage, but those don't stop bombers or tanks. By 1938, the Republic was losing. Nationalist offensives had cut Republican territory in half. The Nationalists controlled most of Spain's agricultural regions and resources. Republican forces were being pushed back on every front. In the spring of 1938, Franco launched an offensive toward the Mediterranean, aiming to split the Republic completely. By April, nationalist forces had reached the coast. Republican territory was now divided, Catalonia isolated in the northeast, the central zone around Madrid cut off. The Republic launched one last desperate counteroffensive. In July 1938, they attacked across the Ebro River in the largest battle of the war. For 4 months, the Battle of the Ebro raged, over 100,000 casualties on both sides. The fighting was as brutal as anything in World War I, trench warfare, artillery barrages, suicidal assaults. The Republic threw everything into the Ebro offensive. They were trying to demonstrate that they could still fight, still win, hoping to change international opinion and bring foreign support. They lost. By November, the nationalists had pushed them back across the Ebro. The Republic's military power was broken. In September 1938, while the Battle of the Ebro still raged, the Munich Agreement was signed. Britain and France appeased Hitler, giving him Czechoslovakia in exchange for worthless promises of peace. The message was clear. The democracies would not stand up to fascism, not in Czechoslovakia, not in Spain. The Republic was doomed. December 1938. Franco's forces began their final offensive against Catalonia. The Republican forces, exhausted and depleted, could barely resist. By late January 1939, Barcelona fell. 500,000 refugees, soldiers, civilians, families fled toward the French border. They trudged through winter snow, starving, desperate, hoping France would grant them asylum. France opened the border, but barely. The refugees were herded into concentration camps on the beach, Le Vernet, Argelès-sur-Mer, Saint-Cyprien. No shelter, minimal food, surrounded by barbed wire. Some refugees would remain in these camps until the Nazis invaded France in 1940, only to be handed over to the Gestapo. The Spanish Republic had one final act of agony to endure. By March 1939, only Madrid and central Spain remained under Republican control. The government, now led by Juan Negrín, wanted to fight on. He believed that World War II was coming soon, and that if the Republic could just hold out a little longer, Britain and France would eventually have to fight Hitler, and would need Spain as an ally. But the army had different ideas. On March 5th, Colonel Segismundo Casado, commander of Republican forces in Madrid, staged a coup against the Republican government. Casado believed further resistance was pointless and that he could negotiate better surrender terms with Franco. For a week, Republican forces fought each other in Madrid. Communist units loyal to Negrín battled Casado's forces. The Republic, in its death throes, was tearing itself apart one final time. Casado won. Negrín fled to France. Casado sent emissaries to Franco to negotiate surrender. Franco's response was simple: unconditional surrender, no negotiations, no mercy. On March 28, 1939, nationalist forces entered Madrid. There was no resistance. The war was over. The cost of the Spanish Civil War was catastrophic. The best estimates suggest around 500,000 deaths, both combatants and civilians. Some historians think the true number was even higher. At least 200,000 civilians were executed by both sides, though the nationalists killed far more than the Republicans. Thousands more died from disease, starvation, and bombing. Spain's economy was destroyed. Its society was traumatized beyond measure. But Franco's vengeance had only begun. After the war, Franco established a brutal dictatorship that would last until his death in 1975, 36 years. In the first years after victory, his regime executed at least 20,000 Republicans, probably many more. Tens of thousands more were imprisoned. Forced labor camps housed hundreds of thousands. The White Terror, as it was called, was Franco's systematic elimination of everyone associated with the Republic. Teachers, union leaders, liberal professionals, anyone who had supported the Republican cause, they were purged. Spain was being cleansed of modernity itself. The Spanish Republican refugees scattered across the world. Some ended up in the Soviet Union. Many of them would die in Stalin's purges. Some went to Mexico, which generously granted them asylum. Some remained in France, living in camps or in exile, until many were caught by the Nazi occupation. The International Brigade survivors returned home to countries that often didn't appreciate their sacrifice. In the United States, Lincoln Brigade veterans were branded as premature anti-fascists, which tells you everything about how the U.S. government viewed their service. Many were blacklisted during the McCarthy era for having fought alongside communists in Spain. Spain itself became a forgotten nation. Franco kept Spain neutral in World War II, though he sent troops to fight alongside Hitler on the Eastern Front. After 1945, while Europe rebuilt with the Marshall Plan, Spain remained isolated, a fascist dictatorship frozen in time. The world tried to forget Spain, but Spain's lessons remained. So what was the Spanish Civil War? What did it mean? On one level, it was a Spanish tragedy, a nation tearing itself apart over questions of identity, modernity, and justice. The questions Spain faced in the 1930s, how to modernize while preserving identity, how to balance freedom with stability, how to address historical injustices, these weren't unique to Spain. But Spain's answers led to catastrophe. On another level, the Spanish Civil War was the opening battle of World War II. All the forces that would soon plunge the world into global war were present in Spain. Fascism and democracy, totalitarianism and freedom, appeasement and resistance. The Spanish Civil War showed the world what was coming. It demonstrated that fascism could be stopped if democracies had the will to confront it. It proved that appeasement wouldn't work, that you couldn't satisfy fascist aggression with concessions. But the democracies didn't learn. Instead of seeing Spain as a warning, they saw it as a problem to ignore. Britain and France continued their policy of appeasement right up until Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939. By then, it was too late to stop what was coming. The lessons of Spain were learned in blood across Europe. The military lessons were learned, though, by the wrong side. Germany learned how to use terror bombing, how to coordinate armor and air power, how to conduct Blitzkrieg. These lessons, purchased with Spanish lives, would be applied in Poland, France, and across Europe. The Luftwaffe pilots who bombed Guernica would bomb London. The tank commanders who fought in Spain would lead panzer divisions into Russia. The Condor Legion's experience became the foundation for German air tactics in World War II. Italy learned the limits of its military power. Italian forces performed poorly in Spain, foreshadowing their failures in World War II. But Mussolini ignored these lessons, confident that fascist will could overcome material weakness. The Soviets learned lessons too. Many of their advisors in Spain returned home to be executed in Stalin's purges. But Soviet tactics developed in Spain influenced Red Army doctrine. More importantly, Stalin learned not to trust the democracies, a lesson that would influence his decision to sign the Nazi-Soviet pact. And what did the democracies learn? Very little, until it was too late. There's another legacy of Spain that's often overlooked: the cultural impact. The Spanish Civil War inspired some of the 20th century's greatest art. Pablo Picasso painted Guernica, his massive masterpiece depicting the bombing of that Basque town, an image that became the universal symbol of war's horror. It remains one of the most powerful anti-war artworks ever created. Ernest Hemingway wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls, his novel about an American volunteer fighting with Republican guerrillas. The title came from a John Donne poem. No man is an island, never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia documented his experiences and disillusionment. His later novels, Animal Farm and 1984, were profoundly influenced by what he witnessed in Spain, the way revolutions could be betrayed, the way language could be weaponized, the way totalitarianism could corrupt even noble causes. André Malraux wrote Man's Hope. W.H. Auden wrote Spain 1937. Martha Gellhorn, Stephen Spender, Arthur Koestler. Spain marked them all. The war became a touchstone for a generation of intellectuals and artists. Why? Because Spain represented something. It was a fight that seemed to matter in a way few conflicts do. It was a clear moral choice: fascism or democracy, tyranny or freedom, the future or the past. That clarity, even if it was sometimes an illusion, even if the reality was more complicated, inspired people to risk everything, to travel across the world, to take up arms, to die for an ideal. But let's end with the people who actually lived through this war. Not the foreign volunteers or the famous artists, but the ordinary Spaniards. Imagine you're a Spanish Republican in 1939. Your side has lost. Franco's forces are coming. You have to make a choice. Do you flee? Abandon everything, your home, your family, your country, and hope for asylum somewhere else, knowing you may never return? Or do you stay? Face whatever justice Franco decides to impose. Hope you'll be overlooked, forgotten, allowed to live quietly? Hundreds of thousands fled. More stayed, either because they had no choice or because they couldn't bear to leave. Many who stayed were executed. Many more were imprisoned, tortured, or simply disappeared into Franco's labor camps. Those who survived faced decades of silence. Under Franco's dictatorship, you couldn't talk about the war. You couldn't mourn your dead. Republican veterans couldn't admit they had fought. Mass graves couldn't be excavated. History was rewritten. Spain experienced what they call a pact of forgetting. When Franco died in 1975 and democracy returned, Spaniards made a collective decision not to dwell on the past, not to seek justice for Franco's crimes, not to reopen old wounds. They wanted to move forward. This allowed a peaceful transition to democracy. But it also meant that for decades, the victims of the war and the dictatorship had no voice, no recognition, no justice. Only recently, in the 21st century, has Spain begun seriously grappling with this history. Mass graves are being excavated. Victims' names are being recovered. The true history is being told. But for many, it's too late. The survivors are gone. The witnesses have died. The chance for justice has passed. On April 1st, 1939, Francisco Franco issued his final war communique. Today, with the Red Army captured and disarmed, nationalist troops have achieved their final military objectives. The war is over. But the war wasn't over. Not really. The battles that were fought in Spain, between democracy and fascism, between tradition and modernity, between freedom and tyranny, those battles were just beginning. Within 6 months, World War II would start. The whole world would learn the lessons Spain had tried to teach. The tragedy of the Spanish Civil War isn't just that 500,000 people died. It's that they died trying to stop something the world wasn't ready to confront. They died proving that fascism could be fought, could be resisted, but only if you had the will to fight. The democracies lacked that will, not until millions more had died, not until Europe was in ruins, not until the Holocaust, not until fascism threatened to consume everything. Spain was the warning the world ignored. It was the dress rehearsal for World War II. It was the test case that showed exactly what would happen if fascism went unchallenged. And when we remember the Spanish Civil War today, we should remember it not just as a Spanish tragedy, but as a universal warning. A reminder that democracy must be defended, that fascism must be confronted early, not appeased, that tyranny feeds on weakness and indecision. The bell that tolled for Spain in 1936 was tolling for all of us. Some heard it and went to Spain to fight. Most didn't listen. And within a few years, the bell was tolling across the entire world. Spain tried to warn us. We should have listened. No man is an island, entire of itself. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. Therefore, never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee.